This time now for authorization, the big challenge. Well, it is not really a big challenge in my opinion. It is actually pretty simple and I'm gonna show you why. Before this one though, we checked authentication. We checked how to identify a user, like who he is that he wants or she is, who wants to access a resource, and we used Keycloak. So if you don't already know what authentication is, go check that video out. The link is available in the description. In this video, we are going to check authorization. We are going to check how Keycloak can give you authorization, fine-grained authorization out of the box. You ask what fine-grained authorization is? Well, it is just fine-grained authorization. So it's detailed, deep authorization. You're just gonna get the magnifier, get into the user's profile and see, okay, he has X, Y, and Z, therefore he can access the resource. Oh, this one doesn't have Y, so he cannot access the resource. So this is fine-grained authorization. We are going to get into some buzzwords which you are going to hear in job interviews or from your senior colleagues. And you will have then, after this video, the ability to go to them when they're talking and then tell them, okay, nice that you know that, but I know how to do it. It's a very big difference, believe me. Let's start. Okay, now let's get into some drawing. So let's say that your manager comes and say, hey, we have an exciting project, and in this project we are going to have 3 people. It's for university, and Bob and John and Alice, they can do certain stuff to the grade. And for example, John and Alice can only read and Bob can create and read. Then you have a question, you are a curious developer, and you say, okay, why Bob can create and read and John and Alice can only read and not create? Then the manager is going to tell you because Bob is a professor and John and Alice are only students. And then in your mind you say, good to know. And since you're smart, what you're going to do is going to come here and say, okay, then I'm going to have a concept, like I'm going to have the professor here. I'm just going to write it down here, and I'm going to also have student here, and like let's say as labels, groups, or as roles. So now I'm going to assign Alice and John to student role and Bob to the professor role. And then I'm going to say, okay, the student can read and professor can create and read. Well, this may come to you naturally. I guess you will never implement something like this because it's going to get really chaotic and it's not scalable, and I guess never has been implemented ever like this. I hope not. Now you come here and say, okay, that came into my mind, looks cool. There is a term for this. The cool guys call this RBAC. So this is RBAC. What is RBAC, you ask? It is role-based access control. Well, now I'm missing something here. If you have noticed this, the professor cannot update. Well, with RBAC, you can still update. Of course, you can still update, but with simplicity. If you want to update the grade and say, okay, the professor can also update, with just having the professor role, this means that the professor now can update every grades in the system, right? So, but that's normally not something that you want. So you want something more secure. So the professors should only be able to update what they have created. So what will happen is that I'm going to introduce you to another term. The first layer that we are in right now here. So these ones, what are they? These are our subject. Now, what are these? So these are our policies. So we say with which policy, with which rule set can I access my entities? So here, this is going to be our policy layer. And then at the end, we are going to, at the end, we are going to here have our resources. This is our protected resources. So now what you see here is that you have the policy, and then you say, okay, how can I access this protected resource? And now if I do, then I'm allowed to do this, right? So at the end, it becomes a permission. So the combination of this policy and this resource creates a permission, and the permission will be calculated to see if you can, like, the permission looks at, okay, the permission gives access to this through this policy. Does the policy applies? It applies. Then the permission is granted. Simple as that, right? So this is how it works. So in this case, in the RBAC case, this role level is our policies. But now this is not enough right now, right? So here you want to also update. Now, what do you do for the update? Let's actually add the update and put it in a square and then explain. I should only be update the grade only if I have created this. Let's say that Bob has an ID in his access token and the grade resource has a you have added a creator ID, and now your policy for update is, if, like, your permission for update is, if you want to update a grade, the creator ID of the grade, the creator ID attribute of the grade must match the ID attribute of the user. And you also should be in the professor role. See, you have an aggregated policy here. You have the combination of two policies. You have a role policy, which you should be professor, and you have a custom attribute policy, which the ID of your user should match the creator ID of your protected resource. The cool guys here that creating acronyms for us, they are calling this ABAC. What is ABAC, you ask? It is attribute-based access control. So this was role-based access control, and this is attribute-based access control. And as you see, this one is a subset of that one, because now you can actually get really creative. Now you can get really detailed and say, for example, I don't want to just limit myself into roles. I want to also check the IP address of the user, the time that the user is accessing here. For example, with the IP address, you can check, is he accessing with the private IP or is he accessing through the VPN IP address from the university? Is he accessing after work or before work? So then you can actually handle what he can do based on more information that you can just have based on your project requirements. So this is called ABAC, and everything up to here, so up to, let's say, here, is Keycloak friendly. We can definitely do that with Keycloak, and whatever comes here we also can do in Keycloak, because right now it's going to be a little bit simple. But if it gets really complicated, let's say that if you have hierarchies, you have a lot of relations that you really cannot sync with Keycloak, because Keycloak doesn't have any hierarchical support. It has groups, and the groups can have subgroups and so on, and then they will share certain attributes among them, but it can get really chaotic, and then you cannot really see why certain access rights could be granted. This one is called ReBAC. So ReBAC is relation-based access control. What does that mean? For example, means Mary manages Bob, so he's the manager of Bob, and again, there is a there are certain roles, and Mary is also a professor, and John and Alice, again, there are students. So as you see, this is not about the role, right? So this is about, again, another type of attribute, which is here a relation. So now we say, okay, the professor can create and read grades, but for the update, you will have a new policy. So let's say here is your update. Let's say for update, you're going to say, okay, you have to be in the professor role, you must be in the professor role, you must be the owner of the grade, or you have to manage the owner of this grade. But we don't have any, so it's an aggregation of 3 policies now. One is the role-based policy, the other one is an attribute, customer attribute-based policy, and then a relation-based policy. The relation-based policy doesn't exist out of the box in Keycloak. And in most cases, you don't need it. In most cases, in your applications, you do not need it. Even with such an example here, we can still manage it in Keycloak. I'm going to show you how in Keycloak. But in most of the cases, Keycloak will just work well and is pretty fast. So with this ugly drawing, let's see how can we handle first RBAC and then ABAC and then partially ReBAC in Keycloak. Okay, so now that we know some theories, let's check how traditionally a role-based access control was working. Still, some projects are based on that because it's simple and straightforward, and some of them are legacy. And some new projects maybe just don't even know a better approach exists. So let's see how it was working and see what is the problem with that approach. So in my university realm, I have our 3 users, Alice, Bob, and John. I have 2 roles, professor and student, which Bob is a professor and the students are Alice and John. Let's go on and then get the token for Bob. So let's decode this to see what is inside it. So as you see, the professor role is just right in there. What was happening before, or still happens sometimes, is that your service is going to know about all the roles that it has to work with. For example, for the grade creation endpoint is going to check if the user's access token, if the decoded user's access token has the professor role inside it, then it is going to grant access. And if not, then it is going to give 403 or 401 based on your implementation. Now, what is wrong here is that, like, one problem that will be seen immediately is that, for example, if meanwhile the professor role is revoked from this user, he still can access. Well, this is not really a big problem because maybe the access token lives a short period and then maybe he can do it now, but then after 30 seconds he cannot do that anymore. The other problem, which in my opinion is a much bigger problem, is when you have multiple services or even this one service and this role is really coupled with your services. Now for some policy changes or refactoring, you decide to rename some of these roles. Now what will happen is that you have to keep backward forward compatibility. You have to have a new role with a new version, suffix perhaps, and then it's a mess. So you have to make sure that these 2 roles can work with each other until you call it deprecated and remove it from the system. Everything is a spaghetti, so everything is really smushed together and it's not clean. But there is a better approach and we are going to check what that better approach is. So now let's go on and see how the modern services are handling their authorization through separation. Now, how does that separation happen? We have to convert Keycloak to our authorization server. How do we do that? We are going to create a client. We're going to call it auth-z, for example, call it whatever you want. And client authentication should be on. Authorization should also be on. Without authorization, without this one, you cannot have authorization on. So both of them should be available. Save, and that's it. So now auth-z client is my authorization owner. So if I go to the authorization tab here, without the configuration that we did, you cannot have the authorization tab visible up there. And in case you have forgotten to turn them on, you can actually come and configure them from here. So now let's go to authorization, set this to affirmative. This the UI is very self-documented. Everything is very well described. There are some issues, but everything mostly is very well described. As you see, with affirmative, it means at least one permission should be granted. If an anonymous is selected, then all the permissions should be granted. So you don't really want that in this case, unless maybe you have another client and then with that client you want to have this set. But in my case, I want to have only at least one client, one permission be set. So let me go on in the resources. So the resources is the point that you have to synchronize from your application. So your resource server is your application, or maybe you have different microservices. They have to synchronize their resources to the authorization server, which is Keycloak in this case. And then Keycloak knows how to authorize the stuff. There are different ways to do this. You can do this, for example, with Outbox pattern. You can create your entity and an Outbox item in your Outbox table, and then that will be asynchronously processed to do something, for example, syncing with Keycloak. You can use Kafka, or you can use a custom service to do that. We are going to tackle that also in another video, but for now it's not a really big deal. Let's focus on how the system works, and then we are going to be worried about the rest later. Let me go on and then create resource. What am I going to achieve? Like what is my goal here? My goal is that the professor be able to create a grade, but the student shouldn't be able. So we are going to achieve that. Let's see how. Let me create a grade resource. So the display name is basically just as it says, display name. The name is a unique name. This is going to be what you are going to synchronize later. For example, you will synchronize grade underline the ID of the grade which is created, and it has to be unique. It has to be a unique ID. Why don't I have a number here or like an ID here? Because I'm going to use this resource for creation. For creation, I do not have an ID just yet. So therefore, I'm going to just say I have a grade resource and I want to see if I can create it. Now we are going to see soon how. The type is for grouping. I'm not going to have it because it is basically going to be grade again, and I don't need it because I already have it in the name. And the grade, the type I'm going to use later for grouping all of the specific grades which I'm going to synchronize. For example, I'm going to synchronize grade 1, 2, and 3. All of them are going to be of type grade. And the type will also be sent from the resource server. Then URIs is also something else that I'm going to show you how you can use it. It is going to be really useful when you do query with permissions, because in most of the documentations from Keycloak that I checked, they have not explained even one word about the query with permissions. So, which is very important. So we are going to get into that too. So this is mostly it. Authorization scopes are what actions this resource is going to have, like what actions are going to be performed on this resource. Well, on this specific one, we only are going to do creation. So, but there's nothing yet is here. So therefore, I'm just going to save this, come back, and then go to scopes, create my action. So my action is create, or scope is create, come back to the grade, and then select it here. So now I have my resource and its action ready. What do I need to do now? So I still need two things. I need a rule set on how to give access to the create action of grade, and I need a bounding between the two. I need a bounding between the rule set, which is the policy, and the resource, which we just created, which is the grade. So let's create the policy. As you see, there are a bunch of policies here. I'm going to explain all of them. So this one you probably don't have right now. This is a test policy which I created. This is deployed into Keycloak, or like added to Keycloak on running. It is a script policy. I'm going to explain the script policies at the end of the video. Right now, I'm going to create a role-based policy. So in a role-based policy, I'm just going to call this student policy. or call it more, to be more specific, student role policy. And then I'm going to select it. So this is for the students, and I would turn this on. What it does is that it will ignore the role inside the token. It will ignore this one. Why? This will solve the first issue that we talked about. Do you remember we said what happens, for example, right now, if I am accessing the endpoint and meanwhile an admin has revoked my role? I still can access. But with this one will be ignored, and Keycloak will directly look into the users table to see if the user has that role. So in this case, it will check if the user has a student role. If so, then the decision will be positive. I need another role, and that would be the professor role. So professor role policy, and I'm going to add a new role for this one, like this. And again, I'm going to fetch the latest information for this about this role. And okay, now I have my rule set. Now I'm going to create the permission to bound these two together, to bound the resource to the rule set. Without this, nothing will happen. So right now, if I actually want to check if I can create the grade, I will always get no, you can't. Let's check actually authorization Keycloak. Let's see how actually that works. So if I search for this, yep. So all of the authorization endpoints are available under the UMA2 configuration. This is an implementation from the OpenID configuration that they already have. And the token endpoint is just basically the same as the endpoint that you issue the access token with new properties. You need to pass an access token now to the same endpoint. So then it will evaluate the access token, the user, and then it will also need certain properties. It needs a new grant type, as you see here, and it is also documented in Keycloak. You will see like the permission. What do I want to do? For example, in my case, I want to do grade create. The left side is my resource. Anything including the sharp sign is going to be my scope, my action. I want to create a grade. And who is the audience? The audience, who is like the owner of the authorization? The owner of the authorization is auth_z client. And therefore, I'm going to add the auth_z client. And the response mode should be permissions. But since I'm just directly checking a permission, I'm just going to set it to decision. So now, also all of these are documented here. If I go down, response mode, as you see, decision is just going to return true or false. Right now, if I run this, I'm probably going to get 401, yeah, because my bearer token, which I'm passing to it, is expired. Let's issue a new one. Go to authorization, put it here. As you see, it says access denied, not authorized. Why does it say that? Because as you saw here, we said first, okay, this we have to set to affirmative and save it. I forgot to do that. Doesn't matter any of these that you set, you are right now always going to get not authorized, because in both cases, they need at least one permission to be positive. But we do not have any permissions to be positive right now. I mean, we have this one, which is the default one and going to give access to everyone, but it is on the default. It is on the default resource, and we are not really calculating, like we are not really querying the default resource here. We are querying the grade and create. What will happen here is that Keycloak is going to detect this, find the resource by its name, find the scope also by the scope name, and based on this will search for a permission. When the permission is not there, it's going to say, okay, I don't know how to give you permission, then I will not give you anything. So this is how basically it works. If I set this to permissive and now I run this again, I will get true. But the difference here is that with enforcing, it tells you if I don't find a permission, I'm going to reject your request. But with the permissive, it says, okay, if I don't find a permission, I still will let you in. So this is a whitelist, blacklist issue, right? It depends on how your model is. If most of your entities are going to be able to access without authorization, then just select this one, because then you don't need to create a permission for every single one of them. But if most of them has to get authorized, then select this one, and then so the rest will be rejected. You have to create a lot of permissions anyways, so then better to have security and enforcing this rather than forgetting to create a permission and giving access to protected resources when the person should not access it. Let's go and create our permission. What is the difference between these two? These two, so if I create a resource-based permission, I will not select which actions will this permission granted. This means that if the policy decides positive for a resource, it's going to grant access to all of the actions. So if you can create, delete, update, and so on, it's going to tell you can do all of this. Well, I'm not going to do this. I'm just going to be very detailed here and then say this is a create grade permission, and my resource that I want to check is the grade resource, is this one, and I want to check its creation with the professor role policy. And this one really doesn't matter here because I only have one policy, but affirmative again basically means at least one policy should be true. Anonymous means that all of the policies should decide positive, and consensus means that the number of positive policies should be greater than the number of negative ones. As I also said, it's very well documented. You can just get into it yourself and play around with it. For now, this doesn't matter. I'm just going to save and then come back here and see what will happen. It says true because, yeah, so I am using the Bob's access token and trying to see if I can create a grade. Now let's add Alice's. So let's get Alice access token. Give the access token to here. I cannot access this. Why? Because I'm student. Now while I have the token, so let's say I still have this token, I have not issued a new token, right? So in this token, I don't have professor role. But let's go on and give her a professor role. Let's go on here. Let's go to Alice, role mapping, assign the role, and add professor. Now, if I run this again, it works because we have turned on fetch role. I'm going to remove this because she is not a professor. We just cheated. Let's go back to auth z client authorization inside the policies. In the professor role policy, we said fetch the role. Don't care about the token. Therefore, now it fetched it and we got the latest information. Now let's go on and add the read permission too, so to have it now complete. But the read permission is not really happening to this one because this one is going to be used only for creation. Let's say you have created something, now you want to read what you have created, right? So let's go to the create resource. Now we are creating this one by hand, but with your real time, like your real life, with your real life environment, you are going to have it like with synchronization. Or maybe in some cases you don't even have the synchronization and your case is very simple, so you don't need the synchronization, and then you can just do the basic role based using a separated authorization server. In my case now, I will assume that my service has synchronized a grade with ID 1 with this service. the display name is still great. And I don't want to do the creation because it is a created instance. I don't want to action creation on a created instance, but it has a type. Do you remember I said we have to group these by this type? Well, let's see why. I'm not going to set this. Let's go on and then add our scope. So our scope is read. We are going to read this. Let's go back to grade. We are going to add this scope, read. Okay. Now if I go on and create my scope-based permission, read grade. Now I have to select my grade that I want to read. The problem which arises here is that now I have to create a permission for each resource that I want to read, and that's not performant, and I don't really want to do that. Therefore, I will select apply to resource type. I'm going to add a resource type called grade, and I want to do the read here, and the policy is professor and student. But here it matters to me that I do not want all of the policies to be positive. I only want at least one of them to be positive. Let's save this and come back to the resources. We have to group this by grade and save. Let's come back and see now what will happen. So this is still on create. Now let's perform a read. Well, to the grade resource with ID grade, yeah, so for the read action, there is no resource with ID grade, right? But there is a resource with ID 1. Now I can read it. Let's actually now change this to permissions. As you see, it is going to show me the grade and the resource ID and the resource name and the scopes that I can do stuff to. Let's add a new one. Let's quickly add a new resource because I'm going to show you something here. Grade 2, grade. Let's say that the professor has synchronized another one here. And now let's go on and yeah, so let's go on and say, okay, I want to read. Oh, now I can see multiple resources are coming back that I can read. So let's go on and then see Bob. What will happen to Bob? Bob should also be able to read. Let's create this again. I don't trust the copying of this. Here. Created this for Bob. Yeah. Okay, so as you see now, Bob also can, I guess it was a clipboard issue. Now, as you see, Bob also can read the same resources as Alice. But now, if I remove the permission, let's see what will happen. So I don't want to pass a permission. Now it is actually going to send me everything that Bob can do. The default resource is there. We have to get rid of it. Let me get rid of the default resource. This is just like an example. Okay. So as you see, it says there is a resource named grade that you can create, and there are grade 1 and grade 2 which you can read. Well, we have our role-based implemented. What you can do in your service is now only passing your resource and is action. Your endpoint is a read by ID endpoint, and you have the ID of what you're going to read, so you can combine this, send this to Keycloak, and Keycloak is going to tell you true or false. You don't need to know if the person is a student or is a professor. This way you keep them separated. And now if there is a new role that can do certain stuff, your service doesn't need to change. So that new role, let's say a manager role, can also now read these resources without you do one single change in your application. With this, let's go on and then see how can now we let me see. Yeah, let's go on and see how can we do query with permissions in this case, because that's also important. Because right now, if if I have another resource type, let's say company, or I don't know, or classroom, let's say if I have classroom or course, let's say if I have course, and then I say read, the user can read all of the resources, including course and grade. But when I want to query grades, I don't care about the courses. I want to only read the grades and filter them out. So let's see how will that work. Okay, so we have now a course, course 1. It has been created from our service, synchronized with Keycloak. The ID is 1, and it also can be read. Now let's see if I say read, what will happen? Oh, now as you see, I can also read course 1. When you want to do a query with permission, let's say not loading just one item, like not by ID, you want to filter something. What you can do is this: you filter this against your database, you run your query, anything that loads, then you are going to filter out, or you are going to send to an authorization server that is going to filter it out, and then you are going to return the result. This will have several issues because first of all, you will load a big load of data which the user is not authorized to see still in your memory. So you will have a lot of data in your memory for no reason, and then perhaps you will get rid of 80% of them because the user can only see 2 courses or like 2 grades, and the rest he cannot see at all. The other issue which will happen with this is, of course, pagination. So you have received some information based on pagination, like 20 items per page. But now from these 20 items which you received in your page, only one of them is readable. So you have to read only one for a page which was supposed to have 20 items in it. So what you should do is to filter before, like you send your filter out information to Keycloak, to your database. You fetch it from Keycloak and then send it to the database. Now what you will do is that you will say, okay, hey Keycloak, give me every resources that I can read. And it tells you, okay, here you are. You can read grade 1, grade 2, and course 1. But now you don't need course 1 because you want to query only grades. And now in your application, you have to go through the array that Keycloak gave you and remove anything else which is not grade. Well, this can work, but maybe not very smart. What you can do is that in Keycloak, authorization endpoint, there is an option called permissioned resource format. By default, it is set to ID. This means that inside the permission, you will say, give me the resources based on their IDs or their names in this case. I mean, here maybe it is a little bit confusing. This ID basically is the resource name which is unique. But we don't want that because we want to read all of the resources that I can read of a specific type. But unfortunately, you cannot filter by type here, by this type that we had here. So you cannot filter by this type. You cannot filter by this type, but you can filter by the URI. And this is where the URI comes in handy. So whenever you are synchronizing your resources, for the ones that you want to do query with permission, make sure that you are having the URI also set. and you know you have set it with a specific format. If you have set the type to be a singular version of your type that you have here, great. Make the URI the same with the / and the plural version of the type. And then this way, easily you can do your query with permissions. Now let me save this and then see what will happen now if I do this. Let's go on, set this permission resource format. And I'm going to set this to URI. And here I'm going to now pass grades. As you see, now I only see the grades which matches the URI that I sent. Isn't that beautiful? So now I actually can get whatever I needed, and then I can just pass this information in advance to my database query and tell my database, do your filter, but do not include, but only include anything that is here. So anything which is not here, I don't want, but also perform my filter. You have full text search, whatever else you have, then you can actually now do this. Well, if you have Elasticsearch, it is even easier because then you can create an alias and then you can put all of these into that alias of Elasticsearch. So then you can have kind of a cache here in this case. You can do a lot with this, but this was how you can handle, or the idea of how you can do query with permissions. Let's go on and see how can now we do the updates. So for updating something, you need the update action. So you need to create the update scope. As you see, I have already done that. I also have already assigned this to my resources, which I want to update. Well, I went on and added them one by one. In your case, it's not going to be like that because your service knows already which action it can do on which resources. So it can sync it with the resources when it sends it. So, and the actions or the scopes are not really an authorization term. Your service already knows them. So you're not injecting them there. You already know, you create, you update, delete a grade, for example. So here we do not do any coupling. Everything comes from your resource server. Now, let's see what do we want to do. I also have added a new user called Mark. He's also a professor. What we want to do is this. We want to make sure that, for example, Mark, when we get his access token, we want him not to be able to read, for example, Bob's resources. And right now we do not have that. So right now both of them, Bob and Mark, both of them can see the same resources. But now let's say that, for example, so right now, why do we call it ABAC? Here's where ABAC comes in. If I go to my resource, for example, grade 1, I will add an attribute. The attribute is going to be, for example, owner ID, and where the value is Bob's user ID, this one. And I'm going to set this. You will set this probably when you are synchronizing. How you can set this? Well, you already have the ID of the user who is creating something, right? So you can just send this with the synchronization. You don't even need to save this in your database. Well, now if I actually query this again, I still see grade 1, but I don't want to see grade 1 because I, as Mark, am not the owner of this. So now what will happen is that I will come back to my permissions. I have an update grade permission, and update grade permission only checks if the professor policy is positive. It doesn't have any other checks. It doesn't know how to check for the owner. Well, for that, there is a policy of type JavaScript. It is a rule-based policy. Unfortunately, due to security reasons, it has been removed from Keycloak after Keycloak 18. So you cannot really upload it. It still exists, but you cannot upload one through the UI, and you cannot upload one through your through the admin endpoints. So for example, if I go to Keycloak features, you may see in some old posts that they tell you enable upload script feature. This is removed. This doesn't exist. There is one script feature which we are going to check later, and this is also by default disabled. And even the documentation is a little bit old. It says to create a new JavaScript based policy, select JavaScript in the item list in upper right corner of the policy listing, but there is no upper right corner. And in the old UI from Keycloak, this creation was here. So they probably meant that. So here you could go and create the JavaScript policy, but right now you cannot do that anymore. So what you need to do, so how can you now do this? Well, you have to deploy your script. You are going to create such a script. For example, for me, I've already created one. You will create a script like this. As you see, I get the evaluation comes from Keycloak itself. You get the context, you get the identity, you get your permission, the resource, and at the end, you get the owner ID from the resource and the ID of the user from the identity, and then compare them. If they are equal, then you are going to grant the permission. Where can you find the documentation for what you read? So if you come here in the documentation in the policy.js, you see that they have this evaluation API. Basically, whatever comes inside this $ evaluation is documented here. So this is the Java interface that they are mapping into the JavaScript. They're pushing this basically to JavaScript. And then now you can go on and see what is inside each of these. For example, I guess, here you can go to the Java docs documentation. For example, the resource permission you will not really find in this page. So it's better to go to the documentation from the Java docs and search for permission. And then in this case, here comes the resource permission. As you see, it returns the resource permission. And then now you can come and see, okay, what does the resource permission has? In my case, when I get the permission here, I get the permission. This is a resource permission type. And now I get the resource from the permission. And then now I check, okay, what does the resource has? Then I go to the resource and say, okay, it has get attributes, and get attribute and get attributes. I'm actually using the same methods here, and then get the owner ID. And if you're wondering why I'm not using const and some of the JavaScript looks old, you have to use ES5. The ES6 is not supported by default. So you have to make sure that you write your JavaScript syntax in ES5 to work with the engine. And now how you deploy, I am using Kubernetes. So to deploy a script with Kubernetes, you will create your jar file from the from this folder. Basically, just a jar command to create an archive of type jar from this directory. And then, since you are in Kubernetes, you can just create a config map. You can simply create a config map from this file. And now if I go to Kubernetes, and your scripts are not really that large, so it's fine to have it in the config map. By default, I guess the config map has a limit size of 1 megabyte. And let me see right now, how big is this? Yeah, it's just 1 kilobyte. So you're completely fine. And now if I go to Keycloak here inside the config maps, I have my owner policy here created. The value is base64 done automatically by Keycloak, by Kubernetes. And now when I want to deploy my Keycloak using Helm chart, I will have an extra volume. The extra volume is called policies. It's going to it's of type config map, and then it's going to get owner policy, and then at the end it's going to copy the owner policy jar subpath. So if I go to this again, as you see, the name of the key from the config map is owner policy jar, and it's going to copy this into the providers. When Keycloak comes up, it's going to install this provider. So it's going to install this custom provider for you. So therefore you can find it here, and then you can use it. The script is not visible here, but as soon as we create it, it's going to be there. So only owner policy, I'm going to call this and save. So this is the code I had, and let's go back and see if we can make it work. So here I want the only owner. Here I must have this option enabled. I want all of my policies to come true. I don't want to have at least one of them, because then if Mark is a professor, which he is, he still will be able to see grade 1 to be updated, and we don't want that to happen. So let's go on and save this and come back here. Let's see, I hope our token is not expired. So we should be only actually see only course 1 now, because the grade 2 doesn't have any attribute. And so basically if I go back to the script, since there is no attribute and the attribute is null, the owner ID is null, therefore this condition will not be matched, and then I will not see the grade 2 either, because it doesn't have an owner ID. But now let's come and actually check with Bob. So let's see what Bob can do. So if I do this, see if actually Bob now can update. So I go back and do this. As you see, I still can do the course 1. Why I can see the course 1 though? I can see the course 1 because if I come to here, I only have the permission for the resource type grade. I don't have anything for the course. But I also can see the grade 1. So grade 1 I also can see, but I cannot see grade 2, as I said, because grade 2 has no owner. Well, this is actually now how you do ABAC. You will create your script, and this is important, right? So this is kind of like the most important part of, in my opinion, the authorization, because you definitely can do this in your code as well, because after the role-based authorization worked, and then you can go on in your code and say, okay, now is this person match an owner ID in my database? Well, with this approach, you don't really need to keep the owner ID anymore, and it can be kept somewhere else, and then you can actually check much more than just this one. This is it. Let's actually, I think it's good to go on and then check the other ones, and then we are going to check a little bit on ReBAC and see how, like, why is it a little bit complicated to have ReBAC in Keycloak. Let me go on and then explain quickly a little bit of these. The aggregated policy means that you will push a bunch of policies together, like anything from here, also your own custom ones, into one policy. How is that useful? Because, for example, in my case here, I'm saying he must be owner and professor. But what if I mean an owner, professor, or manager? There, I need this one, but I cannot have this when I need these two to be true first. So, or I could do this one, but that wouldn't still work. In that case, you're going to come here and then create an aggregated policy, call it owner professor, and it will apply the only owner policy and the professor policy. And it tells everything has to be positive, and then you save this. And instead of this, you are going to go to your permission and then remove this and then add the owner professor policy. Now I can have this affirmative and then add a manager policy. So if I save this and then come back here and create a new policy, call it role, manager role policy. I do not have that role yet. Let's go create it. And fetch the role, add the role from the real roles. It's a manager role. And let's go on now into the update grade permission. I'm gonna say the manager can also update. So then now this way, I still should get the same result. So I should still see grade 1, and for Mark, I should see nothing still, because he is not an owner and he is not a manager either. And in this case, owner is not really a role. You cannot really add owner as a role. Owner is either a relation or an attribute. And in this case, we can handle it with an attribute. Let me go on and add this. Now still Mark can do course 1. But now let's see how, let's go on and then also add the manager. So let's add a manager. Let's call, we were calling her Mary. And this is the manager. Let's go on and give her a role manager. So now let me and give her also username password. So let me go on and log in with Mary. So when I log in with Mary, what we expect, I guess you already know that. I'll give you a moment to think. That's right. So if I right now do an update with Mary, I have to see the other 2 grades as well, because I'm letting the manager role also to see or like to update all the grades. Well, I would like to show you now how you can do, for example, this is a relation now, so this is another extension of the relation. I want to only let Mary to update a grade if Mary is manager of Bob. Not just because she is in the manager role, but she is managing Bob as well. So only in that case, I want to make sure that I'm going to let her update. Okay, one way to handle the relations in this case, I would say, is to handle it with groups. I'm going to create a group called engineering. And let's say that this is the engineering department of the university, which handles like the engineering courses. And inside the engineering, I'm going to add Mary and Bob. So what my intention here is, I want to say under a group, if a user has a role manager, then he manages every other user in that group. Therefore, Mary is Bob's manager. So now if I go back to my client in the authorization, I'm going to add a new group policy. This says engineering group. And I'm going to add a group here. So this is the I expect the user to be in the engineering group. As I said, this is very self-explanatory. You can just go on and then play around with this stuff. The group is also something I'm checking right now. So it says it defined that the policy will fetch users groups from the given claim within an access token or ID token representing the identity asking permissions. If not defined, users groups are obtained from your realm configuration. Yeah, so yeah, okay, so you either can have it inside the claim. I would rather not to do that, but now I have an engineering group policy, and I'm going to add a new aggregated group engineering group manager. So I'm expecting an engineering group and the manager role. Everything has to be there. So the user must be in this to be considered as the manager. So now I also want to mention another policy, which is going to say it is also an aggregated policy. It is going to say engineering professor. So you have to be an engineering professor. This means that you have to satisfy the owner professor. So the owner professor was also an aggregated role policy, and yeah, so we can just use that one, and you have to be in the engineering group. So in this case, then you are a professor in the engineering group and you own a grade. So now if I go to my permission and if I go to change stuff, instead of these two, I'm going to say, okay, so the grade, like all of the grades has to only be handled by the engineering professors and the, let's say, engineering manager, this one. You may ask that, hey, I don't want to add this engineering information here, like the group and so on. Well, in that case, you need to add an attribute in your group where the group gonna get the access token, like the ID of your departments inside the group. Well, in that case, when you want to do something like this, it's better that any entities that you have in your resource server, which has a type of group behavior, like a department, a company, a classroom, a course, and so on, create a group for them in Keycloak with hierarchies. So for example, let's say that the university is one group, then the department is another group under the university, then the course is another group under the department, and go on. So then this way you can aggregate bunch of access token, bunch of attributes inside your access token, and then you can use them here. This is an idea that this is something that you can play around with. So now let's save this and come back here. I, as the manager, so basically Mary should not be able to see grade 2 anymore. Let's go on and then see if it won't happen. So as you see, I see grade 1 and grade 2 here. I still see that. Let's see why. Yeah, okay. So that's true. The point here is that right now I'm saying that I have to be in the engineering group to see grades. But right now I can see any grades and this one is satisfied. I'm not saying that I have to be in the same engineering group as the engineering professor. Well, in that case, I could perhaps say, yeah, so in that case, you have to change the script perhaps a little bit to check this with the owner ID of the grade. So you have to, here you have to have a relation. So let's do that. Let's actually check that to see how we can change the script. Okay, so it was actually simpler than I was going. So the path that I was on, you don't really need any engineering group manager, and so on. We have a simple problem and it has a simple solution. Our problem is we want to give access to a manager which has the same group as our professor. So you don't really need anything here. You need script that is going to check. It's going to get the groups from the owner. It's going to get the groups from the user, and it's going to compare them. So I just created the script here. And in this case, as you see, I get the groups from the user. I get the groups from the owner. And then at the end, I grant access if I find a match. I have uploaded this here, so I created a type of the same group policy, and if I go, then I used it inside an aggregated policy. So inside the same group manager, I expect that the user be the manager and be in the same group as the owner. Now we have to go on and then use it inside our update permission. But let's actually see if Mary can access. So I have set it to decision to show me the decision for the grade 1 update. But as you see, doesn't matter. I cannot, I don't have permission to see this resource. Well, now let's see what will happen if I add this same group manager. Now I can access, because now I am in the same group as the professor. But what about the grade 2? So with grade 2, well, the grade 2 doesn't have even an attribute, so I really cannot access it. Yeah, that's it. As you see, the ReBAC is a little bit tricky, but you definitely can also get it to some extent. So this was the authorization video. I think I have simplified everything enough, but make sure that you go on and try everything that I did for yourself. Play around with policies, permissions, resources. In the next video, I'm going to describe how you can do this in Node.js and in C#. I'm going to show how you can have outbox pattern to synchronize your resources. But for now, that's it. If you still have questions, comment it down below. We will figure it out together. And if you like the video, please make sure you add a thumbs up. If you're not a subscriber, subscribe. And if you didn't like this video, add a thumbs down and comment it why you didn't like the video so I can improve. With all that being said, until next time, cheers.